Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending the transportation session of the ACEEE Energy Efficiency and Climate Policy Forum. My name is Shruti Vaidyanathan, and I'm the Transportation Program Director here at ACEEE, and I'll be your moderator for today. In this webcast, our presenters will be discussing the critical federal policy activities that will be needed under the new administration and in the coming years to create an efficient, low-carbon transportation system. As most of you know, the transportation sector is the single largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the United States, and we will need ambitious and rapidly scalable policies to make a significant dent in those emissions. Before we begin, a few housekeeping announcements. I'm sure some of you have already heard these if you've participated in the other sessions, but nevertheless, here we go. The first one is that your screen is completely customizable, and each area can be minimized or maximized for easier viewing in the upper right-hand corner of each window. If you're unable to see the presenter slides, please click through the widgets at the bottom. Secondly, we may have a few minutes for Q&A at the end of this webcast, but please save your burning questions for the Zoom Q&A session that will occur immediately after this panel at 4 p.m. At the bottom of your screen, you will see various widgets for today's webcast, including one with the Zoom icon. If you click on that icon, it should take you directly to the Zoom meeting. In addition to the Zoom icon, you should see several other helpful widgets, including the presenters' full bios and a resource list to download materials from today's webcast. Next, a recording of this webcast will be made available, and all participants will receive the link within a few days. And finally, next week, you will likely receive a survey with a few questions about the forum, and ACEEE would greatly appreciate it if you took a few minutes to fill it out and give us your candid feedback. We rely on the information that you provide in those surveys to plan our future forums, and we found that it can be super valuable. So without further ado, let me start with some brief introductions of our distinguished panelist speakers. First up, we have Scott Goldstein. Scott is the Policy Director for Transportation for America, an alliance of elected business and civic leaders from communities across the country, united to ensure that states and the federal government step up to invest in smart, homegrown, locally driven transportation solutions. Following Scott, we have Zoe Lippman, who is the Director of Manufacturing and Advanced Transportation at the Blue Green Alliance. She is based in the organization's Washington, D.C. office, where she leads BGA's policy and advocacy on clean technology, manufacturing, advanced vehicles and transportation, and related economic topics. Finally, we have Jonathan Miller, who is a Senior Vice President of Public Affairs for Volvo Group North America. He's responsible for leading Volvo Group North America's government relations strategy and has been with Volvo Group North America since 2007, where he was most recently Vice President for Government Relations and Public Affairs. Each of our speakers today will have about 10 minutes to make their remarks. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Scott, who will be discussing the role that the transportation bill can play in reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. Scott, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I've got a lot to cover, so I'm gonna move quickly. So I look forward to taking your questions if there's anything you'd like to discuss afterwards. But as you heard, I'm here to discuss how a transportation bill in Congress could reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I'm going to skip over this since we just heard about who we are. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today comes from this report that we just released called Driving Down Emissions. So I encourage you to download it. You can see the links there, and you can read the full thing whenever it's convenient. So the first thing to note, folks may already know this, but transportation is now the sector with the largest share of carbon emissions in the United States. And those emissions are increasing, and the majority of those emissions, 83% of them, come from cars and trucks, from driving. And so we have to deal with transportation emissions if we're going to deal with climate change. Our emissions have been increasing even though our vehicles have been becoming more efficient and we see more and more electric vehicles on the roads. The reason is because there's been a 50% increase in driving. And so that's overwhelming the gains that we see in efficiency and clean vehicles. You can see in this chart how emissions have been increasing and tracking the amount that we drive. This looks at vehicle miles traveled between 1990 and 2017. And so the point here on this slide is that we need policy that is more than just a reliance on electric vehicles. We need policy that enables people to make the trips that they need to make by another mode of travel, to make a shorter trip, or to be able to get out of their car and to walk or bike or take transit. There's a phenomenon that many of you are familiar with, but it's induced demand. It's the idea that if you build it, they will drive. So if you expand a highway, you will generate more driving. You will not reduce congestion. Instead, you will generate more driving. And this has been proven to be true across the country. But in an effort to address congestion, what we see nationwide is that we are expanding our highways. To expand a highway, you have to make changes to local land use and local roadways to support all the driving that highway is designed to accommodate. And so you end up with a built environment where it is increasingly hostile to biking and walking and taking transit, and where driving is the only option. And that's how we get to all the driving we talked about in the earlier slide. And that's how we get to the emissions that are overwhelming the efficiency and the electric vehicles on the road. And so we're chasing a solution to congestion that is not only failing to solve congestion, but it's also worsening emissions and climate change. And we can see this because miles driven, as you saw on that earlier chart, but see here again, miles driven has increased 20% in the 100 largest urbanized areas in the United States. So we're driving more, and therefore congestion is going up, as are emissions. We think this is happening because what we're doing is we're just, as I said, chasing that solution to congestion by building more and more roadways and expanding more and more roadways. And you can see that we've been expanding our road network at an enormous rate without any obvious solution to congestion. And just to really put a fine point on it, we looked at the expansion of roadways relative to population in the 100 largest urbanized areas. And what we found was that freeway capacity grew faster than population in almost overall, and yet congestion went up 144%. Here you can see a few case studies of different communities where freeways track population growth, freeways dramatically expand over population growth, and yet congestion goes up. So what we see is you expand freeways equivalent, you get more delay. You expand freeways faster than population growth, you get more delay. And if you expand freeways slower than population growth, you also get more delay. Here's a look at a few more communities. Sprawling car-oriented development leads to more driving. And we need to talk about the built environment. We need to talk about how federal policy incentivizes communities to develop car-oriented communities as opposed to more walkable, transit-connected communities. This sort of development sprawl is also more costly. As we're incentivizing this development, as we're encouraging this development through our federal policy and our local land use decisions and our housing policy, we're imposing greater costs on our communities. Serving these communities with utilities and the maintenance required to maintain those utilities and road networks is very expensive. And per mile, it's more expensive than more connected development. And as I said, this type of development is also hostile to types of travel other than a car. So it's becoming increasingly dangerous to be a pedestrian in this country, even though it's getting much safer to be a passenger in a vehicle in this country. And as you can see, as speeds increase, it's even more dangerous to be a pedestrian. Here you can see a chart that really shows what I said earlier. As it gets more safe to be a passenger in a car, it's getting less safe to be a traveler outside of a car. And that's because our communities are dangerous by design. We're designing for that speed, for the congestion relief we're striving for but failing to achieve in our vehicles. And we're making it so that our roadways are not safe to walk or to bike or to take transit. And here's just an example of what I'm talking about. Here's another example. So we have to reduce emissions, and we need to make a few changes if we want to reduce emissions and build equitable communities. In our report, Driving Down Emissions, these are the overall criteria that we're talking about. We need to get onerous regulations out of the way of providing homes where people are able to drive less. That's a local, zoning decision. We need to make safety the top priority for street design to encourage more and shorter trips. Greenhouse gas reduction needs to be at the core of our highway policy and transportation policy. We need to invest in other options for getting around. Transit is woefully underfunded. Biking and walking infrastructure is woefully underfunded. And we need to design our transportation system to prioritize access to destinations instead of speed of vehicle travel. So I won't go through every point in this slide, but one thing just to note is there are so many different ways in which federal policy is incentivizing vehicle travel and high-speed vehicle travel and highway expansion or highway construction over any other type of travel. And in so doing, we're worsening climate change by generating all this driving. So we like to point out that without reform in the program, without making it safe, without making it making changes to the built environment that allow people to take shorter trips and to walk and to bike, you're going to see the same unsafe road to be a pedestrian or a cyclist. You'll just see some electric cars driving on that road. And here's another example of that. Without reform, we'll just have cleaner congestion. So we argue that we have a policy problem, not a funding problem. And that's very important because for those of you who are following the conversation on Capitol Hill about transportation, it's often about how we don't have enough money and we need to raise the gas tax. But we want to focus on the policy and how we're spending that money, whatever amount of money we ultimately decide to invest. So our priorities are to first focus our investments around maintenance. We're expanding our road network, as I mentioned, at an astronomical level while our maintenance backlog is growing. So we need to prioritize maintenance in our road networks and also make sure our transit systems are in a state of good repair. Here you can see 37 states saw an increase in roads in poor condition despite massive new investments of funding during this period. We need to design for safety over speed. If it's not safe to bike or to walk, or all of these are the means in which people access transit. So if it's not safe to bike or walk, it may not be safe to use transit. Then we're not going to be able to reduce emissions from transportation. We need to design for safety over speed. And we need to connect people to jobs and services. That's what really matters. Can you get to the doctor? Is it convenient to get to school? But right now, the way we measure success in transportation is how fast are the cars moving. Never mind if they're moving fast over a 50-mile trip to the doctor or to the school. So we need to rethink what we measure and value. And we think access is what we should be measuring and valuing and not exclusively vehicle speed. We looked at the House and Senate bills that were introduced in the current Congress that's about to come to an end. The House bill, as you can see in this chart, met all three of our criteria. The Senate bill did not. It's important to note that the Senate bill was only a highways bill. The committees that have jurisdiction over the rest of the transportation system did not act in the Senate. But the highways portion is the largest portion of the bill. In the House, all of the relevant committees acted. They passed a full transportation bill. And as you can see, we were very much supportive of that bill. So the House bill is called the INVEST Act. And so just some highlights related specifically to climate change. There is a requirement that states measure and track important outcomes like greenhouse gas emissions and access to jobs and invest to improve access to jobs and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's more funding for transit and better policy to encourage transit operations that are truly effective for local communities. There's a suite of policies to make sure that our roadways are built to support biking and walking and all road users, including vulnerable road users. So we really thought that the approach to safety was meaningful. And there was a requirement that our roadways be maintained before we expand our roadways, which we are very supportive of. So overall, while there are things that we would improve, we found that on the climate front, there was a lot of progress in the INVEST Act. Here's just more examples of that. We actually created a climate and transportation agenda in partnership with the organization Third Way. And so you're looking at some of the criteria that we set out in that agenda. The House package on the right, the Senate package on the left, and you can see that in general, the House met the mark on our agenda. And here you can see the rest of it on passenger rail. The House had major investments there. We talked about some of these other things already. Public transit, a lot of great investment in the House bill on public transit. So real quickly, just before I go over this slide, the thing, if it hasn't already been made clear that I want to make clear is that we need a transportation bill that treats all of the different modes of travel, biking, walking, transit, passenger rail, as interconnected. Every trip on transit begins and ends as a pedestrian. Every trip in a car begins and ends in a pedestrian. And the same thing for passenger rail. And we need a transportation system that treats these things as interconnected, prioritizes safety and climate change as goals that must be addressed, and then supports investments to do that. And we think that the House bill accomplishes that overall framework. So it's important to let Congress know that we need bold climate and transportation policy. The conversation, as I mentioned, is very often in transportation about funding. When it gets to climate change, it tends to be about how do we electrify all of our vehicles. But the issues that I just talked about the built environment, about how federal policy incentivizes driving over everything else, does not get the same level of attention. So we need to let members of Congress know how important it is for federal policy to catch up to the needs of really everybody, and certainly to address climate change. So what can you do? We would encourage folks to contact their House and Senate member to tell them what they like about the House bill, and certainly what they did not like about the Senate bill, which, as I argued, failed to make much progress on climate. You can write a letter to the editor in your local newspaper about this issue. We have a social media toolkit where you can use your social media to discuss your thoughts about these issues and why the Senate bill doesn't get us far enough on climate. We also are right now encouraging folks to sign on to a letter to Congress urging fundamental reform in transportation. It's going to be, and you can see the link there to sign on. The letter, which you can read at that link, describes the need to prioritize maintenance, prioritize safety, and prioritize access to jobs and services, and explains how these things are necessary to address climate change. So we certainly encourage folks to sign on to that letter. We also are in the middle of another issue that's very important, which is to break the so-called 80-20 split between funding for highways and funding for transit. This has been the status quo since 1982, where highways get 80% of federal funding for transportation and transit gets 20%. The idea is that the funding comes from the gas tax, which is a user fee and should not be diverted to transit. But as the gas tax is increasingly insufficient to cover our transportation expenses, we would argue that the logic for this 80-20 split does not apply. And if we're going to do a stimulus bill or another authorization bill to set 5 years of policy, we very much would like to see Congress take up whether that should be allocated 80% highways and 20% transit. So Representative Chuy Garcia is about to introduce a resolution to make the case that highways and transit should be funded equally, and we would welcome any of your support on that resolution. So that's the end of my presentation. I look forward to taking any questions and the rest of the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you for flagging that sometimes the activity around VMT reduction tends to get lost in the conversations that focus on transportation electrification. But that being said, let's move on to our next speaker, Zoe Lippman, who will be presenting on how ramping up deployment of EVs can not only help the transportation sector in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but also serve as a vehicle for job creation. So Zoe, take it away.
Sure. Thanks so much, Shruti. It's great to be part of the panel. And for those who don't know Blue Green Alliance, we unite America's largest trade unions and environmental organizations to solve our climate and environmental challenges in ways that build a stronger, fairer economy. Our work at the moment, our work is guided currently by a pro-worker, pro-climate agenda platform we call Solidarity for Climate Action that's really focused on jointly addressing the climate, economic, and equity challenges facing working people today. And as part of that agenda, we underscore how important it is to rebuild good jobs in American manufacturing in particular. We highlight how we can't rebuild prosperity if we fall behind the rest of the world in building the technologies of the future, or if working people don't see the gains from innovation or a clean economy. And I would underscore that we also can't build the support and momentum we need for climate action if working people and communities don't see the gains from those solutions. And I want to just note that this is really key as we think about the holistic approach we need to address speed the transition to cleaner and cleaner vehicles. Now, all of this is true in 2019. It's even more true today. The crises that we've seen over the last year have really underscored the challenges that we're already facing workers and communities across America. Even if we're looking just at manufacturing, we've seen some bright spots. We've seen automotive factories retool quickly to build respirators and things like that. But we've also seen really terrible gaps, not only gaps in supply chains to provide critical protective equipment, for example, but also tremendous gaps in worker safety, in the disproportionate impact on essential workers, and also disproportionate impact on low-income communities and workers and workers of color. It's really underscored that if we're going to see a lasting and effective recovery, we have to solve our climate, economic, and racial equity crises together. And I would note here that the clean technology example in this arena is really mixed. We have some instances where there are good jobs being built in clean technology, and others where we have advanced emissions-reducing technology being rolled out with business models that are inequitable and degrade working conditions. So we have today this opportunity, really an urgent need, to head down a stronger path. And nowhere is this more true than in the auto sector. As folks have talked about before, the shift to clean vehicles, the transformation of our transportation sector is really critical. Folks have mentioned transportation is now the largest source of emissions, but transportation is actually, as Scott mentioned as well, is really essential to daily life. It provides people access to work and to opportunity. It's a critical piece of people's household budgets. The statistic you hear all the time is that the car is often a household's second largest purchase after their house. I think that's in a time in which many more people had the privilege of owning a home. For many households, the car is the first largest purchase. And the auto sector and the transportation sector broadly, but the auto sector in particular, is absolutely central to the economy. Manufacturing, to begin with, matters. 1 in 11 workers work in manufacturing. It contributes $2 trillion a year to GDP. A third of economic output, if all of the services and goods are put together. 2/3 of private sector R&D, and the auto sector is the single largest piece of the manufacturing economy. It supports millions of workers, over 1 million direct manufacturing jobs, as well as millions of other interconnected jobs. And even perhaps equally important to the challenge we face today, it's really an iconic symbol of what it means to move to a clean economy. How we go about shifting the automotive sector will be a test case of whether climate solutions really do deliver to working people. And that being said, the industry is at a crossroads. We've seen over the last decade that the auto industry can be transformed in ways that both deeply cut emissions and boost jobs in manufacturing. under the innovation under the Obama era fuel economy standards, and the manufacturing policies that were introduced jointly through the 2007 Energy Bill and afterwards. But that trajectory is really the trajectory and the shape of the industry is at stake. The choices that corporations and policymakers make now will really determine whether, as we move to electric vehicles and other clean vehicles, whether we make worse the outsourcing and offshoring of the automotive supply chain, the degradation in job quality, the loss of union jobs, or whether we galvanize a revitalization in the industry. There is real risk. Hundreds of more, somewhere in the round between 100 and 200,000 workers, depending on how you count it, work manufacturing engines and transmissions for internal combustion engines alone and the components that go into them. If we're going to move to a clean vehicle sector that strengthens and builds good jobs across the country, we need to make sure that we're bringing more of that supply chain back, that we're building good jobs in the factories we have today and in the new ones we're building. And we have to recognize that the impacts on workers are not harmful impacts on workers and manufacturing communities are not an inevitable result of technological change. They're the result of some very specific policy and, as I said, corporate decisions. And the policy choices we make now really will matter to what the outcome looks like. And we urgently need a proactive agenda to ensure a rapid and equitable transformation of this industry. So, fortunately, we are seeing all kinds of policy being discussed federally now. Much of it using tools we already have. That is such a proactive agenda. That includes four big chunks: sound standards, rebuilding American manufacturing and supply chains, using our public spending and our employment incentives wisely, and ensuring fairness and equity across the clean economy. Worldwide, countries are rushing to capture the economic and jobs benefits of this transformation, and they're using all the tools in the toolbox. And we need to do likewise if we're going to see the gains we can see from this transition. So I want to just quickly walk through these chunks in a little bit more detail. First, fuel economy and vehicle greenhouse gas standards. I won't spend a lot of time here. Many folks know this is a huge topic in this area, but it is failure to act. Failure to act in ways that are competitive with the rest of the world is not an option. We depend on strong. We depend on globally competitive standards to create the certainty, the investment certainty for companies to invest here in the next generation of technology. The two charts you'll see here, one is with my apologies to ICCT, a little bit of a Photoshop of one of their well-known charts that just shows the trajectory globally of the standards for different countries, and what would happen if we were to not go back to the path that we had been on of strong upwardly moving standards in the U.S. And the second is from a report that we have done looking in detail at how the standards drive investment in the components and technology that goes into achieving fuel economy and electrification. But I obviously won't go into those details, but I want to say that the standards are necessary, but they are not sufficient. We know the outcomes are better when not only do we have the driver of investment here in this country, but also that we are encouraging those investments to be made here. Second, we need a comprehensive strategy to rebuild manufacturing in the U.S. as a whole and supply chains, but in particular in the auto sector. That's both elevating a comprehensive strategy as a nation, but also using and making far more robust investments, but also using the tools we have. And I want to focus on three super fast, as I know I'm running out of time. First, the incentives we have, whether that's for 48C tax credits, the ATVM program and DOE, or manufacturing conversion grants to make investments now to enable companies to retool, rebuild, expand facilities to build the technologies of the future here. Those can also be targeted to encourage investment in the pieces of the supply chain, like battery cells, that we do not sufficiently manufacture in this country yet. Secondly, those investments can be targeted to drive reinvestment in the communities and jobs and workers that need it most. I won't talk too much about R&D and workforce, except to say that these two can be really focused at supporting expanding real jobs and real manufacturing expansion, not separate from that. Secondly, I really want to underscore here the opportunity to do public investment right. I think we touched a little bit on in Scott's presentation on some of the opportunities to invest in a variety of fleets and infrastructure, both in the light, medium, and heavy duty sector. And we have proposals, whether it's Senator Schumer's Clean Cars for America or the proposals to improve and update the 30D EV tax credit, that are huge consumer incentives to transition to electric vehicles. But just as it is absolutely critical, if we're going to get the economic and jobs benefits out of an infrastructure investment, that we focus on ensuring domestic content by America in the case of public investments and high labor standards, the same standards and conditions are critical for our other incentives. That way, we ensure that we're complementing the standards and our manufacturing investments with the tools we use to drive demand. I would also underscore that there are important conditions that can be attached to these incentives to ensure that we are enhancing pathways into good manufacturing jobs for the communities that need it work most, and for workers who have been underrepresented in manufacturing. Also, I want to underscore here that fairer incentives mean faster deployment. Not only can ensuring that this, for example, the EV tax credit support vehicles built here and components built here, and that they build strong jobs, help build a coalition to support that tax credit, but similarly ensuring that we address, ensure that there are vehicles available, that there are incentives available for used vehicles, and that there are incentives to ensure that all kinds of drivers, all income levels have access to EV incentives and see benefit from them. Putting those things together creates a more viable incentive. Similarly, and I'm not going to go into detail here, maybe this is something that others can talk about, but I think we've seen in the West Coast really exciting opportunities to speed the deployment of clean truck incentives and progress through mechanisms that also improve working conditions and environmental benefits in local communities jointly. So moving forward, closing up right now, we see a whole range of vehicles, so to speak, that we'll be looking for going forward, where there's opportunity to take on these tasks, whether that's in a recovery investment, which is absolutely critical both immediately and in the next Congress, whether we're talking about major climate or manufacturing or infrastructure investments, and we believe those things should be done jointly, or energy or tax bills, or the surface transportation bill, as Scott mentioned. And I want to underscore that we need to do the standards right. It matters how we structure fuel economy and greenhouse gas standards so that they support a viable manufacturing and jobs transition at the same time. And I would say we want to build in manufacturing, good jobs, and equity at every point. I've talked about a bunch of the different provisions here. I won't go into a great deal of detail, but good jobs, targeted investment, systematically focusing on rebuilding clean technology supply chains, ensuring we're reducing pollution and making our communities and workplaces safer and more resilient as we do this, and investing in jobs and training together and access to jobs and economic opportunity. And so with that, there really are no shortcuts when we've tried to do this without incorporating all the stakeholders and interests. We can't get the kind of climate goals achieve the climate goals we need. Auto sector has shown that when you have all the stakeholders meaningfully at the table and you address their interests in good, sound policy, we can do amazing things. We have this opportunity to shape the future economy here, and what it means to do climate solutions right. And it's really exciting that we have those tools in front of us, and now is the time to act. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Zoe. Comprehensive overview of the interface of transportation and manufacturing and how the policy levers we have available to us can actually make that happen. Moving forward, let's move on to our final speaker. Jonathan Miller will be presenting on federal activities that will help get electric heavy-duty vehicles on the roads in the near future. Jonathan, the stage is all yours.
Thank you very much, Trudy, and thanks to ACEEE for having me join you all today. So just a bit about Volvo Group and Volvo Group North America. We are a Swedish company headquartered in Gothenburg, Sweden. But we do have a very major presence in North America and in the United States in particular. You can see our various locations up and down the East Coast. While we do co-own the Volvo brand, there's been a lot of discussion today about cars. We actually sold Volvo cars more than 20 years ago in order to focus on commercial vehicles. We bought Mack Trucks. We own Volvo Trucks here. We're also in the bus space. Prevost is our coach business. Nova Bus is our transit bus business. And we produce all of our trucks for the North American market here in the United States. And actually all of our truck plants are UAW represented. So that's just a bit about us. So just about a month ago, we made a public commitment to sell 35% of what we sell in the year 2030 will be electric vehicles. And this is part of a sort of a way station to the point where we see that we'll be fossil-free 100% of what we sell by the year 2040. And we see that in the space of electric vehicles, of hydrogen fuel cells, of renewable liquid fuels as well. But how we get there is going to vary depending on the market, and it's also going to vary based on the truck segment. You know, heavy-duty trucking is a very many different kinds of trucks, very different use cases. You have tractors pulling trailers. You have vocational trucks, cement mixers, dump trucks, refuse trucks. They all do a different duty cycle. All of their customers are for-profit entities. So the trucks are very much customized to do different kinds of jobs. So we see different kinds of segments are going to be more amenable to, say, electric vehicles than others. To begin with, distribution is going to be a good segment, and waste collection is another good one. Part of that is driven by how those vehicles operate. They go out and do their deliveries, or they go out and pick up the garbage, and then they come back and they can be charged overnight, and they go out and do that every day. As you move into regional haul, where you've got to be driving a couple hundred miles a day, you're going to need more capabilities with your charging. And then when you get into long haul, we actually see that, we actually believe that fuel cell technology will be the way to address long haul rather than electric. I can get into that in just a bit. So what you're looking at here is the first fully electric refuse truck that Mack has delivered to New York City, the Department of Sanitation of New York. We're a major supplier of refuse trucks to New York City. And this truck was delivered just earlier this year and is going through its paces. It's in a pilot project. We've also delivered the second refuse truck electric to our customer Republic Services, and that's being operated in Hickory, North Carolina. Again, doing some demo testing. We expect that we'll have commercial deliveries of our Mack refuse trucks starting in 2021. But the big news for us is today, coincidentally, about an hour and a half, I guess about 2 hours ago, we commercially launched this very truck. This is a Volvo Class 8 electric truck, the VNR Electric, where we commercially announced at 2 o'clock today that we're open for orders for these trucks, and we're going to be building them and selling them next year. These trucks are built in southwestern Virginia. This is a straight truck where you can put a box fan that you see on the back. We also have a tractor version with a fifth wheel that can pull a trailer. Again, Class 8 trucks used primarily in distribution and short delivery cycles. What you see here is the Volvo LIGHTS project, and LIGHTS is an acronym for Low Impact Green Heavy Transport Solutions. This is a public-private partnership that is funded in part, or I should say about half of it is funded by the California Air Resources Board through their cap and trade program in the state of California. So we're working with South Coast Air Quality Management District, two of our customers that you see there, DHE and NFI, our dealer in Southern California, some universities, the ports of Long Beach and LA, and then a number of companies in the electric charging station. And so we're in the process of delivering 23 electric trucks that are running in Southern California. And this is really kind of an interesting, a unique partnership to look at, for sort of a soup to nuts look at how do you commercialize electric trucks, because this is a very new area for us. And so far, the results have been very good. And that's in part why we were able to announce the commercialization of this truck today. So some of the lessons that we've learned from this project, really important to engage with the utilities and local officials for the infrastructure. It can take as long as a year to build an electric heavy-duty charging station. These are not the kind of charging stations that you can that you would have in your garage to plug in your electric car. These can be 1.5 megawatts, which is equivalent to powering an apartment building or actually a factory. So some major electric requirements there. And the infrastructure can take some time to get approved. You got to go through all the zoning and the planning and all of that. And so what we've learned is that you've got to start that process before you even order the truck, because we can build the trucks in a much quicker time than it takes to get the infrastructure built. So, and then this infrastructure, of course, is expensive. And so you've got to look for grants to help defray the costs. And that can be useful as well. So some of the challenges that we see, coming out of into this new paradigm shift of electric vehicles, it's not just us, the OEMs. We've got to work with fleets. We've got to work with the utilities. And importantly, we've got to work with policymakers at the federal, state, and local level. The biggest obstacle that we're seeing right now is the charging infrastructure. There are a number of programs that can help there. California has some, and there are others at the state level where they've got grant programs and things. Congress in both the House passed version of moving forward, H.R. 2, and in the Senate EPW bill have alternative fuel corridor support. I think tax credits would be helpful in that space as well. When you get to the vehicles, these vehicles are more expensive up front. And so tax purchase grants or incentives could be very helpful there. Our customers have to pay a 12% federal excise tax on every purchase of a brand new Class 8 truck. So 12% on a very expensive electric truck is also a disincentive to purchasing that. So that's another area that could be addressed. And then there are things like market enablers that could help. The California's low carbon fuel standard is helpful in terms of lowering the operational costs, and perhaps that's something that could be expanded to other states, and perhaps even at the national level. That's just a little bit of the run through. We know this transition is not going to be easy, but we're very optimistic about the future. We know that it's going to take a lot of work. We're excited about the possibilities with the Biden administration and their support in this space, and hope that they'll be able to work with Congress to get some of this happen in the next infrastructure/highway bill. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that great overview of heavy-duty policies. So unfortunately, it looks like we've run out of time during this session to ask any questions. I encourage all our attendees to use that Zoom link to join us in our Zoom breakout rooms for the Q&A session. So you should be able to see a Zoom widget at the bottom of your screen. And once you get on Zoom, I think we'll take a few minutes to ask some general questions of the panel, and then you'll be able to choose which speaker from this panel you'd like to have additional conversation with. So again, the widget is at the bottom of is in the menu at the bottom of your page, or you can copy a link that we've provided to you and paste it into a new browser. So thank you for attending. Hopefully we see you in the Zoom breakout rooms, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of the forum presentations. Thanks.